Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. Sign the separation agreement by the end of the day.
Tasha, please. Not like this.
The midday sun beat fiercely down on the sterile steps of the General Hospital. Dr. Darius Blake, 41, a black single father, stood numbly before the HR desk. Amara, his 8-year-old daughter, waited quietly in the hallway, clutching her backpack, her tight curls haloed in the harsh fluorescent light. Karen Holt, the administrative director, pushed a termination notice across the counter with a cold, impersonal stare. "Your contract ends today, Dr. Blake," she stated. Darius simply nodded, accepting the dismissal. He gathered his badge and belongings. Amara took her father's warm brown hand and they walked out. Darius took slow, deliberate steps down the sidewalk. In the distance, the faint, distinct sound of heavy helicopter blades began to vibrate. Dr. Darius Blake, at 41, was a study in quiet intensity. The lines around his deep brown eyes were carved not by age, but by years spent making split-second decisions where life hung in the balance. As a black single father, his existence was now centered on the predictable yet profound schedule of raising Amara. His current role was an emergency room physician working on a short-term contract, a necessary compromise after a lifetime dedicated to high-stakes medicine. Years ago, Darius had been a decorated frontline combat physician in the Army. He didn't just treat battlefield injuries. He redefined emergency trauma surgery under fire, earning accolades that he rarely, if ever, spoke of. That chapter of his life closed abruptly after a devastating mass casualty incident that claimed the lives of several service members he couldn't save. The sheer volume of loss, the chaos he could not control, extinguished the fierce competitive drive that once defined his career. He left the military not in defeat, but in search of an environment less steeped in the constant threat of loss, a place where he could simply be a father first. The civilian job was meant to be his anchor, a stable environment where Amara could wait for him, accustomed to the sight of her dad in scrubs, ready with her backpack and a patient smile. This routine was his new battlefield, a relentless yet stabilizing rhythm. Darius was a disciplined, reserved man. His focus was always on the patient, never the politics. He viewed his medical skill as a solemn covenant, a promise to prioritize human life above all else. As a black man who had fought to be taken seriously in more than one uniform, that covenant meant everything. This unwavering focus, however, brought him into direct and repeated conflict with Karen Holt. Karen, the new administrative director, was a creature of efficiency, prioritizing cost-cutting protocols over human factors. She saw medicine as a flowchart and the hospital as a business unit. Darius saw it as a desperate, sacred fight for survival. The friction had been constant. Darius had repeatedly and vocally opposed her attempts to cut corners on equipment maintenance and nurse-to-patient ratios, arguing that such reductions inevitably compromised patient safety and violated his professional oath. In too many meetings, he'd felt the familiar tension of being the only black man at the table, knowing that his firm tone could be misread as aggression while he was simply trying to keep people alive. The core of the recent conflict centered on the replacement of the hospital's only ECMO machine, a device vital for life support during severe heart and lung failure. Darius argued it was end of life and dangerously unreliable. Karen dismissed the $1.2 million expense as non-essential capital expenditure. For Darius, relying on that machine was a gamble he couldn't take with a patient's life. It was a betrayal of his oath. The final heated debate had occurred that very morning over the replacement of this critical but expensive piece of monitoring equipment. Darius's argument, based on empirical evidence and his experience in the field, was dismissed as insubordination. For Karen, his ethics were an expensive inconvenience that jeopardized the bottom line. The contract termination was swift and absolute, an exercise of pure administrative power meant to send a clear message to the remaining staff. Walking out, Amara looked up at him, her small brow furrowed with confusion, sensing the heaviness of the moment. "Daddy," she whispered, her hand tightening in his, "did you save someone wrong?" Darius stopped, knelt down on the sterile hospital sidewalk, and looked his daughter directly in the eye, his deep brown gaze steady. His military training kept his tone level and reassuring. "No, sweetie," he answered, his voice firm and steady without a trace of regret. "I chose safety. I refuse to let them put profit over people. That's always the right choice." He rose, picking up the small box containing the last vestiges of his professional life, his stethoscope and a worn photograph of Amara. In the picture, a beautiful black family, just the two of them, smiled at the camera, her tight curls wild in the summer light, his arm wrapped protectively around her. He carried the weight of his dismissal, a quiet, discarded professional, but he carried his integrity, which was worth far more than any job title. His only immediate concern was the calculation already running in his head, scrambling for rent, health insurance, and school fees. His path was now uncertain, but his principle remained uncompromised. He felt a cold, familiar knot in his stomach, the same dread he'd felt years ago, realizing that the system, civilian or military, sometimes prioritizes logistics over the human cost. He squared his broad shoulders, resolving that Amara would never pay the price for his moral stand. Father and daughter began the long walk home, a path usually traversed quickly by car after a late shift. Today, every step was measured by the new, heavy reality of unemployment. Darius's mind, accustomed to rapid-fire triage, was now running complex financial models: rent, car payment, Amara's school trip, health insurance. The numbers swam against the backdrop of the busy city street, each calculation adding a fresh layer of stress to the silent indignity of his dismissal. Amara, sensing her father's internal struggle, deliberately tried to step on his shadow, a small, endearing gesture of closeness that momentarily drew him out of his spiraling thoughts. Darius focused on her presence, her warmth, the dark brown of her tiny hand in his, rather than the cold, administrative betrayal he had just endured. They stopped at a corner store for a break. While Darius bought 2 bottles of water, a sudden, piercing siren ripped through the ambient city noise. It wasn't a standard ambulance wail. This was a series of quick, high-pitched alerts, a rhythm signifying an extreme, high-priority emergency transport. Darius's head snapped up instinctively. His military training made him instantly recognize the cadence, a rare, complex emergency signal meant for specialized units moving at speed. His eyes scanned the direction of the sound, his body tensing in an involuntary, practiced response. He could almost visualize the scenario, the type of injury, the personnel involved, the next steps. But then, just as quickly, he forced himself to relax. He reminded himself he was no longer part of the system. His hospital ID was confiscated, his expertise unwanted. He was just a black man walking home with his daughter, unemployed and discarded. The thought was bitter, a harsh metallic taste in his mouth. He continued walking, but the tension lingered in his shoulders. The siren was a brutal echo of the past, specifically the disastrous night in Kandahar. He remembered the overwhelming number of casualties, the frantic scramble for working equipment, and the terrible realization that a faulty generator had caused critical delays in a field hospital. That mechanical failure, a purely logistical oversight, had contributed to the deaths of 2 young soldiers he had promised to protect. The memory was sharp, the smell of ozone, the screams, the sticky sensation of blood he couldn't wash off. Never again, he had sworn. That memory fueled his current fight with Karen. He had resigned himself to a quieter life, determined that he would only save lives under conditions of absolute professional integrity. Amara, who had observed the entire silent drama, her eyes wide with concern, piped up quietly, "But Dad, what if they really need you?" Darius squeezed the plastic bottle tightly, unable to meet her gaze. "If they need you." That phrase was the very core of his identity, the principle he had fought for just hours before. He felt the pull, the irresistible professional gravity of an unmet crisis, a feeling of responsibility that transcended his personal situation. But he was an outside observer now. He walked on, trying to deafen himself to the distant, fading siren. The air, already thick with midday heat, began to shift. A strong, unexpected gust of wind whipped Amara's tight curls across her face, carrying with it a strange, acrid scent of jet fuel and dry grass. Darius pulled her closer, scanning the sky. The low, rhythmic thumping sound that was steadily growing louder, not receding like the ambulance, replaced the silence in his head. It was a powerful, distinctive sound that cut through the city's noise, a sound that immediately triggered Darius's long-dormant military instincts. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump quickly grew from a distant murmur to a resonant physical vibration. It wasn't a civilian craft. The weight and speed were immense, the frequency of the blades indicating immense power and urgency. Darius looked up at the sky, shielding his eyes from the fierce afternoon sun. Two dark shapes, moving with aggressive speed and precision, appeared over the skyline. They were military medical evacuation helicopters, identifiable by their specialized markings and their low, fast trajectory. The sound escalated into a deafening roar, shaking the windows of the storefronts they passed and forcing pedestrians to stop and shield their ears. The noise was overwhelming, a sudden violent interruption of the city's routine. The two massive aircraft were not heading toward the hospital. They were aiming directly for the public park just 2 blocks ahead, the only clear landing zone nearby. Darius stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes, once full of weary resignation, now sharp, focused, and instantly calculating the situation. His heart pounded with the sudden, undeniable recognition that the crisis was no longer distant or abstract. The crisis was coming to him. He was no longer walking home. He was standing in the path of a massive, unfolding emergency. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The twin medical helicopters descended rapidly, kicking up a massive vortex of dust, leaves, and debris as they slammed down onto the grass of the small public park, the only clear space in the area. The noise was deafening, forcing Darius and Amara to cover their ears. The landing was executed with aggressive speed, signifying the gravity of the situation. Within seconds, a rear ramp dropped from the lead helicopter. A young, crisply uniformed officer, his face tight with controlled urgency, jumped out, scanning the shocked crowd of onlookers. He bypassed the standard emergency crews just arriving from the hospital and ignored the stunned police officers. He looked directly at the crowd, cupping his hands around his mouth, his voice strained against the immense roar of the engines. "Where's the doctor? We need Dr. Blake." The shout, amplified by the soundscape, was heard by everyone present, echoing the desperate, immediate nature of the call. Darius froze, his entire body locking up. Dr. Blake, the name discarded and irrelevant just an hour ago, was now being called out with desperate military authority, pulling him back into the reality he thought he had left behind. Suddenly, the hospital administrators appeared, running from the direction of the emergency entrance, having realized the extent of the emergency. Leading the pack, breathless and disheveled, was Karen Holt. She saw the two massive military aircraft, the frantic soldier, and the overwhelming scale of the intervention. Her eyes landed on Darius, standing quietly on the sidewalk, a small box under his arm. She took a step toward the officer, confusion etched on her face, but she was too late. Karen's mind was a frantic scramble of rationalization. Blake? Why him? He's a short-term contractor. The sight of the military officer calling his name negated every spreadsheet and cost-cutting measure she had ever championed. The officer was already heading towards Darius. Amara, sensing the enormous sudden shift in the atmosphere, instinctively tightened her grip on her father's hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and profound pride. Darius took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying his nerves. This was familiar territory, the chaos, the noise, the immediate need for a calm, commanding presence. He gently squeezed Amara's hand and began to walk forward, shedding the mantle of the unemployed civilian with every step, stepping back into the role of the black combat surgeon the military called when everything went wrong. The officer, recognizing the doctor's characteristic measured gait, the unmistakable walk of a man who takes charge, met him halfway. He snapped a sharp salute, his respect instantaneous. "Dr. Blake, sir, we have a highly complex critical trauma patient. Offshore incident, deep compression, and shrapnel trauma. He's stabilized by the field team, but we've run out of surgical time. We need specialist intervention now. He spoke quickly in the precise shorthand of military trauma, revealing the terrifying nature of the emergency. The patient is a deep-sea salvage engineer. A pressurized equipment failure caused extreme blast force combined with deep water immersion. He's suffering from concurrent decompression sickness, internal shrapnel hemorrhage, and severe hypothermia. The conditions require immediate surgery that simultaneously addresses the blast trauma and manages the rapid pressure fluctuations during transport. He paused, his eyes fixed on Darius. Sir, your profile is unique. You are the only surgeon in the National Registry who has executed complex trauma procedures under active high-pressure mobile conditions in a non-sterile environment. We couldn't get clearance for a civilian OR in time, and your experience with similar deep compression cold environment battlefield wounds is unmatched. The clock has stopped. You're the only one. The implication was clear. Only Darius possessed the rare combination of surgical skill and tactical real-world knowledge to handle this specific, life-threatening scenario in a non-sterile, moving environment. The hospital's best surgeons were experts in comfortable zero-movement ORs. This man needed a doctor who could operate mid-air. Karen Holt, having finally caught up, stood paralyzed a few yards away, her hands clutching her clipboard. Her face was a mask of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. She finally realized the sheer, unquantifiable value of the black doctor she had just dismissed for budget reasons. The man she labeled insubordinate was now the singular focus of a high-priority, life-or-death military operation. Darius didn't hesitate. He didn't ask about liability, pay, or protocol. His doctor's oath, dormant for an hour, flared back to life, consuming all other thought. The need was absolute, transcending personal grievances and financial concerns. He only glanced back at Amara, his decision final and unwavering. He knelt, kissing her forehead. "Stay right here, sweetie. Don't move. I'll be back in an hour. Be brave for Dad." He gently detached her hand from his. Amara, seeing the professional focus in her father's eyes, the return of the warrior she knew, nodded solemnly, trusting him completely. Darius stood up, dropped the small box containing his belongings, and handed his purchased water bottle to Amara. He then looked at the officer. "Let's go. What's the latest Glasgow? Get me a rundown on his oxygen saturation and core temperature. Those are the variables we fight now." Without another word, he moved toward the medical helicopter, his gait now quick, purposeful, and entirely professional. As he climbed aboard, the massive engines roared to full power, and the rotors began to bite into the air, whipping a huge, blinding cloud of dust and debris over the park and the stunned administrative director. Karen instinctively raised her arm to shield her face, standing utterly alone amidst the chaos she had caused. The twin-engine helicopter tore through the sky, quickly leaving the city behind and banking sharply toward the vast, glittering expanse of the ocean. Inside the cramped, vibrating cabin, Darius was instantly back in his element. The noise, the adrenaline, the limited resources. This was his true operating room. He was a surgeon of chaos, perfectly adapted to the instability. The patient, strapped to a stretcher, was critical. The injury exactly as described, complex trauma requiring immediate, precise field surgery to prevent massive systemic failure. Darius took command instantly, his voice a steady, calm anchor against the mechanical noise and the high-stakes pressure. "Prep the field IVOY access. Secure. We are going in now." His instructions were succinct, militarily precise, and left no room for question. The small, highly trained med team obeyed without hesitation, recognizing the immediate, non-negotiable authority of his skill. Darius quickly assessed the situation, recognizing the unique danger. The internal bleeding was accelerating, masked by the hypothermia. The decompression sickness meant he couldn't afford rapid changes in altitude. He had to operate immediately while the pilot maintained a precise low-altitude flight path. He worked with impossible speed and accuracy, his brown hands moving with the surgical precision of an engineer designing a watch. He utilized every centimeter of the tight space, every flicker of available light, performing a complex procedure that should have required a fully equipped surgical theater. The procedure itself was a masterpiece of improvisation under duress. He used a combination of specialized clamps and a rapid deployment suture technique honed during his most desperate combat deployments to seal the deepest vascular wounds. The vibration of the helicopter was a constant, destabilizing enemy, forcing him to anticipate the movements, timing his cuts and sutures between the engine's rhythmic pulses. The med team watched in awe. This wasn't surgery, it was surgical combat. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. His focus was absolute, his rhythm unbroken. The clock in his head was the only timekeeper. After a breathless, tense period, Darius finished securing the area with a temporary but life-saving fix that defied the constraints of the environment. Vital stabilizing. We've bought him the time he needed. Get us back to the nearest level 1 trauma center fast. The lead flight medic, a seasoned veteran, leaned in, his voice thick with admiration. Doctor, I've seen a lot of things. That was textbook zero-fault execution. You just did a thoracotomy and massive blood replacement at 150 knots. Darius merely nodded, his focus already shifting to post-op care. His job was only half done. A radio transmission crackled with the good news, confirming the patient was stable enough for transport. Meanwhile, down in the park, Karen Holt stood rooted to the spot, the dust slowly settling around her. She was having a visceral internal reckoning. This isn't just about money or budgets, a cold voice whispered in her mind. It's about capability. I prioritized quarterly reports over a man who can save a life mid-flight. The shock was giving way to a sickening wave of professional self-doubt. The raw, desperate sound of the military officer's shout, "We need Dr. Blake," was now the unshakable soundtrack to her administrative failure. She realized she hadn't just fired an employee. She had temporarily disabled a critical national-level asset, a black combat surgeon whose skill reached far beyond her spreadsheets. All for the sake of a $1.2 million expense that now seemed paltry and meaningless compared to the life currently hanging in the balance over the ocean. She was the system he was fighting, and the system had lost. Her clipboard slipped from her numb fingers, the papers scattering like useless confetti on the dirty grass. What if he fails? What if the patient dies because I created the conditions of his despair? The weight of potential blame, a burden far heavier than any budget deficit, crushed her corporate facade. She looked at Amara, still sitting quietly, radiating a quiet, absolute faith in her father, and felt a burning, humiliating shame. Back in the air, the pilot's voice cut through the intercom. "We're clearing the coast, preparing for descent to the trauma center now. Good work, doctor." Darius wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, his hands shaking slightly, not from fatigue, but from the adrenaline finally receding. The patient's pulse was strong, the saturation numbers climbing steadily. He looked out the small porthole, seeing the city skyline, the hospital, the place that rejected him, now appearing in the distance. He had saved a life in the most hostile environment possible, reaffirming his oath not to the hospital, but to himself. He was the one they called when the systems failed. A thought struck him, clear and sharp. They tried to take my job, but they can't take my skill. They tried to take my worth, but they can't take my principle. He had been discarded, but necessity had proven his value to the world. An hour later, the distinct welcome sound of the returning choppers grew loud again. As the first helicopter touched down, the ramp dropped immediately. Dr. Darius Blake, his scrubs stained with blood and sweat, emerged. He looked utterly exhausted but whole, the triumphant look of a doctor who had just won the hardest fight. Amara, who had been sitting patiently on her backpack, jumped up. Ignoring the remaining security line, she ran straight to her father. Darius immediately dropped to one knee, embracing her tightly, burying his face in her curls. It was a moment of pure, silent victory. The doctor was safe. The father was home. The crowd, the nurses, the hospital staff, they all watched, their applause tentative at first, then rising to a wave of spontaneous, undeniable respect. No one saw an unemployed civilian. They saw a hero, their doctor, covered in the glorious evidence of a life saved. The military officer stepped forward, addressing the crowd that had gathered. a crowd that included the entire management and nursing staff from the general hospital. He ignored Karen Holt entirely, focusing solely on the man who had just saved a life. "Dr. Blake," the officer said, his voice ringing with professionalism, "you saved a life today that no one else could have touched. On behalf of the armed forces, thank you for your service and for your irreplaceable skill." It was a public, undeniable validation of Darius's professional identity. The applause this time was deafening, the true sound of a community recognizing its own hero. Darius stood tall, holding Amara close, accepting the praise with his usual measured calm. He then turned his attention to Karen Holt. The administrative director, tears welling in her eyes, finally moved forward, her corporate posture completely broken. "Dr. Blake, Darius," she stammered, addressing him by his first name in front of the entire staff. "The ECMO machine is being replaced immediately, effective this afternoon. I was wrong, fundamentally, disastrously wrong. I apologize for my judgment and for the damage I caused. You are indispensable to this facility." She wasn't just apologizing for the firing, she was publicly apologizing for her flawed philosophy of administration, forever treating a black surgeon with his capabilities as a disposable line item. The hospital's chief of staff immediately stepped in, swiftly navigating the crisis with an immediate offer. "Dr. Blake, we are offering you a permanent, long-term contract, effective immediately. Full executive compensation and a dedicated budget for your department. More than that, we are creating a new position for you. Director of Clinical Safety and Standardization. You report only to me, and you will have final veto power on all resource allocation pertaining to patient risk." The offer was lavish, immediate, and utterly sincere. But Darius was not swayed by the money or the prestige. His focus was, and always had been, the patients. "My terms are simple," Darius stated, his voice clear and firm, addressing the entire administrative team and ensuring every employee present could hear him. "The safety protocols I requested this morning, the updated equipment budget, the appropriate staffing ratios, must be implemented without delay and guaranteed in writing. We will not compromise patient safety for the bottom line ever again. Furthermore, the incident review must document that the failure to purchase the ECMO machine was a direct administrative error that placed patients at risk. This is not about saving my job, it's about holding the system accountable." The chief of staff nodded quickly, humbled by the terms. "Agreed, doctor, completely. You set the standard now. We need that accountability." Amara squeezed her father's hand, her smile beaming up at him, a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. The family's dignity had been restored, not by the job, but by the principle. Darius took Amara's hand, picking up the small box he had dropped earlier. The two of them walked out of the park, leaving the stunned administrators scrambling to implement his demands. As they continued their walk home, 2 search and rescue helicopters flew overhead, their noise no longer a symbol of rejection, but a salute to the man who was walking home from a crisis, not toward one. It wasn't the job title that defined the doctor. It was the moment someone desperately needed to call his name. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Sometimes purpose finds you on the walk home.